today, along with my co-host, Elise Giuliano from the Harriman Institute at Columbia. This is our next installment in the New York City Russia Public Policy series that we've been running here for about 6 or 7 years now, jointly between the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU. Today we have a really important topic, an incredible collection of panelists here to come talk to us about us and sort of fill in really important gaps in our understanding of what's going on here. And this is going to be on understanding Russia's role in the Israeli-Gaza conflict. Just to give everybody a quick view into the format that we're using here, for those of you who haven't been here before, the format we'll use today is it's a webinar. So the way it's going to work is that we are going to introduce each of the speakers in turn. I'm going to pass it over to Lisa in a second, who will introduce them right before they're about to speak. There'll be a short, brief introduction of the speakers. We'll have a more full bio in the chat, which you'll be able to see. Each of the speakers will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. And then we'll open up to questions and discussion. We have until about 1:30 p.m., so we're hoping to have a good half an hour for questions and discussion. Given that this is a webinar format, it means that you guys can't use the chat in order to ask questions, but you can use the Q&A. And one nice feature of the Q&A is that you can list your questions there at any time. So if while speakers are talking, you can think of a question that you might want to ask them later on, that's perfectly fine, and you can just jot it down into the Q&A. Elise and I will then pull questions from the Q&A to pose to our panelists. Before we start, I also want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their continuing support of this series. We would not be able to do this without them. So thank you all very much. I'm going to pass it over. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to pass it over to Elise Giuliano now from the Harriman Institute.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone again, and we will start off with our first speaker.
Along with my co-host, Elise Giuliano from the Harriman.
Okay, sorry, a little technical thing. I'm going to start off with our first speaker, who is Anna Borshevskaya. She is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute's Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation program on Great Power Competition and the Middle East, where she focuses on Russia's policy toward the Middle East. She has published a book published in 2021, Putin's War in Syria, Russian Foreign Policy and the Price of America's Absence. Great title. As well as many peer-reviewed journal articles and public policy journal articles. Anna?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As the first speaker, I thought I would start with laying out a few broad points for the discussion, and I hope we can get more into details on those points during Q&A. So I am going to center my remarks around 3 main points that I'd like to lay out, and I'll conclude with a few policy implications from a U.S. policy perspective. First, October 7th, of course, represented a cardinal change for the Middle East at large. But it also represented a cardinal change for Russia's approach to the Middle East. And that is that more explicitly than at any other time in his tenure, Vladimir Putin has chosen a side, and he has chosen a side of Hamas. My second point is that the ongoing escalation in the Middle East is in Putin's interest. And he is likely likely fueling that escalation rather than simply reaping benefits of the spoiler. And then the third, if we take a step back from the Middle East and think about where the Middle East fits into the bigger picture from the Russian perspective, from Russian state perspective, from American perspective, Ukraine remains the top priority for the Kremlin. And when it comes to global goals, global calculations, that is how the Kremlin is looking at the Middle East, but also other global activities. So that is sort of the big picture perspective. And let me turn to each one separately. So with the first one, what did I mean by Putin choosing a side? Vladimir Putin's approach to the Middle East has been one where he aimed to build ties with all actors in the Middle East, that is, all governments and internal opposition movements to them, but also conflicting parties in the region. And that's Putin styled himself as a peacemaker who could talk to Israel, Hamas and Hezbollah, Iran, the Gulf states. In fact, he styled himself, he positioned himself as this mediator, and he presented his mediation services over the course of his over 20-year tenure in power. The reality, however, was always far more complex. In reality, Putin always leaned closer to anti-American forces in this region, and that was chiefly Iran and Iranian proxies. Much more explicitly, and perhaps as an exception even to that role of a peacemaker, Putin had chosen a side before, and that was in Syria when he intervened militarily in September 2015 to save Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad from an imminent demise. However, so in the scope of this approach, October 7th has highlighted much more explicitly than previously in Putin siding with anti-American forces in the region. So if you look at his reaction, he did not directly condemn Hamas. He waited approximately 10 days to call Benjamin Netanyahu. The first words that he uttered after October 7th were really blaming the United States for the ongoing situation in the Middle East. And that response spoke volumes. There were others. For example, he talked about Israel's campaign compared to a siege of Leningrad. He played on false World War II themes, played with the idea of Nazism, which again has to do with Ukraine and how he was looking to cast this issue together with the Ukraine, his war on Ukraine. And it is not so much that Putin explicitly said, I am choosing a side. He did not do that. In fact, he subsequently once again offered to mediate between Israel and Hamas. But the totality of his response so heavily leaned against Israel that it really break a cardinal, it represented a cardinal break in how Putin had approached this region before. But it doesn't mean that the idea of Putin presenting himself as a peacemaker in the region is gone by any means. It is simply a much more overt statement of a trajectory that was already in place for quite some time. Frankly, I think it was inevitable that we would find ourselves here, that Putin would react in this manner. So secondly, escalation is in Putin's interest. Why is it in Putin's interest? Well, for one thing, because he understood immediately that the attention of the West would turn away from Ukraine, and that ongoing attacks on U.S. forces and Israeli forces would present opportunities. And of course, he has taken full advantage of these opportunities. Which suggests that most likely he calculated he could afford to have worsened relations with Israel because the resultant chaos in the Middle East was more beneficial to him. He also likely calculated that he could afford to alienate Israel because once again, the benefits of chaos in the region were far more useful to him. And there were multiple. There was as an information campaign that the Kremlin had unfolded throughout the region. He had played up the anti-American narrative in the Arab world. Last but certainly not least, the Kremlin's interest in driving U.S. forces out of Syria, which a process that was already underway. This current ongoing escalation only benefits these Kremlin interests. And we're certainly now seeing a discussion in the United States about U.S. forces leaving Syria, and there's now a discussion about the same in Iraq. So if you look at the regional picture, anti-Americanism that you see across the Middle East, the Iranian nuclear program that continues to unfold, the growing Russia-Iran partnership that we've seen unfold over the years that has become accelerated with Russia's war on Ukraine. These are all enormous benefits to Russian state objectives. And on top of which, of course, the future of Ukraine hangs in the balance. And this brings me to my third point, and that is that Ukraine clearly remains a top priority for the Kremlin. And I guess what we would call Russia's more explicit alignment with the global South should be seen in that context. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in and of itself was Russia's, again, most explicit challenge to the liberal world order. It was never just about Ukraine. We've seen Putin make his statements time and again that this was far bigger than that. He had explicitly said that the West, in his mind, attacked Russia using Ukraine. So this is about a rearrangement of the liberal post-World War II order that the United States had put in place. Again, Ukraine is not the first iteration of that, but it is by far the most explicit one. And from that global perspective, the Kremlin tends to look at the European and Middle East theaters as more connected than disconnected. And that is the way we should be looking at these theaters as well. In other words, from a great power competition perspective, there's more overlap between Middle East and Europe than disconnect. But we in the West tend to separate these theaters. So let me conclude with policy implications for the United States. First, the future of Ukraine hangs in the balance. This year may very well be a defining one for Russia's war in Ukraine, but that has global implications. It has global implications for America's leadership. It has global implications for how Russia is perceived in the world and certainly in the Middle East. We now see aid to Ukraine hanging in the balance and difficulty juggling two priorities at once with Gaza and with Ukraine. So from a Russian state perspective, it makes all the sense in the world to continue to fuel proxy warfare and to continue to create problems for the United States on the global political arena to distract, to divert attention, and simply to wait the West out. And this was Putin's, it appeared from the beginning that Putin was looking to wait the West out on Ukraine, get to the point where the West is tired. And it really has to do with a failure of leadership, I would say, on the part of the West to articulate to the American public how potential failure of Ukraine, how a lack of Ukrainian victory would essentially impact an average American. And we're now unfortunately seeing the challenge of this leadership, as well as a challenge of connecting Ukraine and Gaza together. So this leaves us with tough choices in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine, and I will end there.
Thank you, Anna. Now we will turn to our second speaker, Professor Mark Katz, who teaches government and politics at George Mason University. He is the author of 5 books and a specialist on Russian foreign policy, on foreign policy in general. His most recent book is Leaving Without Losing: The War on Terror After Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2019, he was appointed a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Mark?
Thank you. Thank you so much to the Harriman Institute for the invitation. Anna Borshevskaya is a hard act to follow, but I will do my best. I think that I certainly agree with everything that she has said. Certainly, the Israel-Hamas conflict has provided some real benefits for Russia. Certainly, the distraction from the war in Ukraine, that Moscow has helped portray the U.S. as practicing double standards, opposing Russian military action against Ukraine while supporting Israeli military action against Gaza. And that Russian criticism of U.S. policy and of Israel aligns Moscow with the global South or the global majority. And Putin has even seized upon Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping to promote alternative routes through to the Red Sea, through the Arctic Ocean, the North-South transport corridor, Russia, Iran, India. But I would argue that the conflict in Gaza also poses problems, actual or potential, for Russia. Moscow has played much less of a role in the Israel-Gaza conflict than it did in the Cold War Arab-Israeli conflicts. And I see that Moscow is in less of a position now to affect the behavior of either side. I also think that Moscow's interests could suffer through an expansion of the conflict, especially if it leads to an Israeli-Hezbollah conflict. While the damage Israel has done to Hamas has not really hurt Russia's position in the region, similar damage Israel might do to Hezbollah could mean that Hezbollah has to reduce its presence in Syria in order to fight the Israelis in Lebanon, thus putting a greater burden on Russia to keep the Assad regime propped up in Syria. Is this, is the Assad regime, definitely going to suffer? Well, not necessarily, but I think that increases the possibility. Israel's already reportedly giving less notice to Russia about its attacking Iranian and Hezbollah targets in Syria under the terms of the Russian-Israeli deconfliction agreement, whereby the Israelis let the Russians know that they're going to attack, they're not going to attack Russian targets, but the Russians don't seem to do much to prevent them from hitting Iranian and Hezbollah targets. Now it seems there are some reports that the Israelis have stopped in some instances, some that they have been giving, much less time notice. Also, I think one of the risks that Putin runs is that is damage to Israel's policy of not providing military assistance to Ukraine. This might change if the Israeli leadership decides that Moscow really is actively helping Israel's Middle Eastern opponents, it seems to me. How much damage Israel could do, that's not clear, but I think the Russians have benefited by Israeli restraint when it comes to Ukraine. And I think that it's not something that they want to see. There's also a recent Carnegie Politica report indicating that Russian oil exports to India via the Suez Canal have been affected. In other words, what the Houthis have been doing in the Red Sea hasn't affected a lot of Russian exports, but in this one instance, a lot of Russian oil exports to India do go through the Suez, and it's just going to make those more expensive and the profit margin just that much less. So while the Israel-Hamas conflict has helped Moscow in some ways, I think it also poses significant risks for Moscow. And I just want to say a few words comparing Soviet policy toward the Arab-Israeli conflicts in the Cold War to the present. At the end of the June 67 Arab-Israeli War, the Soviet Union broke diplomatic relations with Israel, a move that was highly popular in the Arab and Muslim worlds. But Arab and public opinion about the Soviet Union became more critical of Moscow as the perception grew that Moscow was not supporting the Arabs as much as the US was supporting Israel. And when Egypt's Sadat decided that he would never receive sufficient military support from the USSR to drive Israeli forces out of the territory it had occupied, he sought its return through diplomatic means, and so turned to the US, which could talk with both sides, while the Soviet Union could not. Now, years later, Russian Middle East specialists whose careers spanned the Cold War years through the Putin era, including Evgeny Primakov, criticized the Soviet Union for having broken diplomatic relations with Israel and handed a diplomatic opportunity to the US. And in fact, during the Putin era, the Kremlin came to see Moscow's and Washington's position as being reversed. It was now Moscow who could talk to all sides in the Middle East, while Washington wouldn't talk to Iran, to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the Assad regime. Now, Washington's lack of contact with Hamas obviously hurt its ability to engage in conflict resolution between it and Israel, but Moscow's ability to, quote, talk to all sides, unquote, so far hasn't enabled it to do so either. Being able to talk to all sides may be a necessary condition for successfully acting as a mediator, but it's not a sufficient one. America's Middle East conflict resolution efforts have usually involved providing substantial payoffs to the parties involved, as occurred with the Camp David Accords and the Abraham Accords. And so long as the war in Ukraine continues, Middle East actors seeking an alternative to the US as a mediator might see China as more desirable than Russia, as Russia has less ability to provide payoffs. Now, as Professor Elizabeth Wishnick, a Columbia University PhD, noted recently, on November 20th, foreign ministers from the Palestinian Authority, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and Indonesia traveled to Beijing to encourage Chinese officials to help bring about a ceasefire in Gaza. Even prior to the Hamas attack, China had been promoting itself as a possible mediator between the Palestinians and Israelis. I would also note earlier, Saudi Arabia and Iran turned to China, not Russia, for help in restoring diplomatic relations between them. Now, in my view, Beijing doesn't really seem capable of mediating between Israel and Hamas, but Moscow can hardly be pleased that Muslim actors seek mediation from China after Russia has held itself out as capable of playing this role for so long. There's that if you don't want to go with the Americans, there's an alternative now to Russia, which had not been true during the Cold War. And just also want to address the question, does Russia have a strategy toward the Middle East? I'm not sure. To me, it's not clear that it has a strategy or whether it acts on an opportunistic basis. As many in the Middle East have commented, the US has given Moscow plenty of opportunities to exploit. But in my view, Putin has sought all along to maintain good relations with all opposing sides simultaneously. And this has worked partly because, despite Russia's close ties to Iran, Arab Gulf states and even Israel have all believed that cooperating with Moscow can keep Russia from drawing closer still to Tehran. And some recent analysis coming out of the UAE even suggests that they see limits to how far Russia and Iran can cooperate. I'm not sure if it's wishful thinking or not, but they seem to think that their economic ties with Russia so greatly outweigh Iran's ties that this will sway Russian behavior. In other words, Moscow's success at maintaining good relations with opposing sides simultaneously partly depends on the willingness of various Middle Eastern parties to play along. Now, I guess I would disagree somewhat with Anna. I think that instead of Moscow choosing Hamas, what I feel is that Moscow has aligned itself with mainstream Sunni Arab governments with regard to the Gaza conflict. In other words, that join them in criticizing US policy, criticizing Israel, but not doing all that much to help Hamas or even to harm Israel. Indeed, like certain Arab states, Moscow's ties to Israel continue. They're not good, but point to the hour-long conversation between Putin and Netanyahu in December, and Netanyahu's asking Putin for help in getting Russian citizens released by Hamas, and Putin responding positively immediately. Doesn't seem to have worked so far. Indeed, I think that like certain Arab states, I think that Moscow's ties to Israel will continue. But its ability to maintain ties with all sides simultaneously, especially with those who are fearful of Iran, may be challenged, in my view, both by Russian dependence on Iran for drones and other weapons, as well as escalating conflict involving both the US and Iran. In other words, that the more dependent on, the more aligned with Iran that Russia is, I think that the Arab Gulf sides, in other words, what they're fearful of is Iran. And to the extent that they don't see Russia as able to restrain Iran, then I think that they're not going to be as close to Moscow as they like. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Now we turn to Hannah Notte, who is the director of the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center of Non-Proliferation Studies and a senior associate in the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She works on Russia's foreign policy, arms control, and non-proliferation issues, as well as Russia's relations with the global South, Russia's military, and general issues of arms control in the Middle East. She publishes in many outlets, and you can see them listed in the chat, and is a co-author of a forthcoming book with Stanford University Press entitled Death Dust: The Rise, Demise, and Future of Radiological Weapons Programs. Hannah?
Thank you so much, Elise. And I should say that the book has in fact come out last month in December, so it is now available. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really great to join colleagues and friends on this panel, and you'll find that I don't have much disagreement with what Anna and Mark have said, and they have already said a lot. So let me try to build on what they said, bring in perhaps some additional points. And what I want to do is talk a little bit more about what concretely Russia has done since October 7th. So what have Russian actions over the past few months actually looked like? Then talk a little bit more about how I think Russia's navigation of the current Middle East crisis fits within broader Russian foreign policy. And I won't give sort of policy recommendations, but I'll also try to offer some thoughts about what we might see Russia doing moving forward, and what role Russia might or might not play in any diplomacy that might unfold going forward. So both Anna and Mark have already talked to Russia's pro-Palestinian positioning that was adopted after October 7th, which I mean, I agree with Anna, even if you accept that there was an affinity for the Palestinian cause, particularly in the Russian MFA previously. The way that I think Russia went in siding with Hamas was quite noteworthy. I think you can say that a side was chosen. If you look at Russia's information campaign that has unfolded since October 7th, and certainly Russia's positioning on the UN Security Council and at the United Nations, which I wanted to dig in a little deeper. I think once we moved from sort of the early Russian talking points about what happened, where we had a lot of Ukraine-related conspiracy theories with Russian officials saying that Hamas got its weapons from the Ukrainian battlefield, that the Makhachkala incident that we saw in Dagestan some weeks after the event, that was planned from Ukraine. Once we moved sort of past that, what has Russia's discourse at the UN mostly consisted of? One thing was already mentioned. We see heavy blaming of the United States in particular, or of the West more broadly, for this crisis. It is US policy that has led us to this place. The United States, quote unquote, monopolizing the peace process over many years, burying the peace process, killing the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. So there's a blaming for this crisis on the United States. And then as events have unfolded since October 7th, an accusation against the West of being engaged in double standards and even racism in the way that it navigates vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine on the one hand, and then the war in Gaza on the other, blaming inaction of the United Nations on Western blockage. We saw this early on, for example, that Russian officials would state that certain bombings in Gaza could have been avoided had the US not blocked this or that draft Security Council resolution and had it supported a ceasefire. But there is also, I think, something really important going on here, which is that Russian discourse is effectively combining the wars in Ukraine and in Gaza into one broader meta-narrative in which both conflicts are presented to a global audience as a fallout from US pretensions to global hegemony and as indicative of Western double standards and hypocrisy. And it's interesting, I think, the Russian discourse at the UN regarding Ukraine and Gaza. On the one hand, Russian officials are saying that it is impermissible to compare both conflicts because Russian diplomats on the UN Security Council have said on multiple occasions that whereas Russia has just destroyed almost no civilian infrastructure or has sought to avoid civilian harm in its own quote-unquote special military operation in Ukraine over the last 2 years, what we see Israel doing in Gaza is a sort of completely different approach, raising it to the ground. So Russia says you cannot compare the two situations. On the other hand, there's a certain comparison and linkage going on, where Russian officials have, for example, stated again on the Security Council that the residents of Gaza have lived under a similar paradigm as Ukrainians in the Donbass, Gazans on territories occupied by Israel, just as residents of the Donbass have been living under the, occupation or, of the Nazi regime in Kiev. So these are the kinds of comparisons that are being drawn in official Russian discourse. Besides this discourse that we've seen both in media portrayal and then on the UN Security Council, in terms of Russian actions, I do think that we're seeing a further tilt of Russian policy towards more broadly the axis of resistance in the Middle East. So Iran and Iranian partners and proxies, whether that is Hamas or the Houthis or Hezbollah or other groups. Russia has hosted both Hamas delegations now twice since October 7th, but also a Houthi delegation last week. Russia has also, I think, already prior to October 7th, stepped up its battlefield collusion with resistance actors, particularly in Syria, since the invasion of Ukraine. If you look at Russia granting greater freedom of maneuver to Iranian-backed groups in Syria, which I'm sure is something that Hamid Reza, our next speaker, can talk to more about, that is something that preceded October 7th. And I think we're seeing a continuation of that practice. Of course, Russian rhetoric right now very heavily sort of supporting an Iraqi push for negotiating a withdrawal of US troops from Iraq. Russia continues to rile against the US presence in Syria. We saw that at the Astana summit last week. So I do think that we see a further tilt towards the axis of resistance. It is not a sea change. I do very much agree that Russia is keen to continue to maintain its ties with the Arab states of the Persian Gulf and with other Arab states. Now, the way I would look at it is that those ties are very important and will continue to be important to Moscow because they promise mostly economic dividends to the Kremlin, which are very important at a time when we've had a severe rupture, a severe decoupling for Russia from Western economies over the past 2 years. But tilting towards the axis of resistance promises what I would call more geopolitical or security dividends. By fueling those actors who continue to, destabilize the situation in the Middle East, as we now seeing playing out on an almost a daily basis, and certainly with many attacks by Axis groups over the last few weeks, that produces a degree of instability in the region that is beneficial to Moscow in light of its broader geopolitical confrontation with the West. Now, I do agree with Mark that Russia does not want that to play that game too far or to see the situation destabilize to a significant degree, because there are risks and certain costs for Moscow that it could accrue. One point that I do agree with is that Russia does not probably want to see a full-blown war between Israel and Hezbollah, because it would likely engulf Syria and threaten Russian interests there. The situation with the Houthi strikes from the Red Sea, it seems to me that there are potential economic downsides and risks for the Kremlin that it needs to consider. But the way I look at it at the moment, today, the benefits outweigh the costs or the risks from Moscow's point of view. The costs or risks are more in sort of in the future domain. They could materialize if things really escalate and if there would be a full closure of the Suez Canal, which is not a point to which we've gotten. So those risks are in the future. Right now, with the situation as it is, I think the benefits to the Kremlin are greater. And then the last point I wanted to make in terms of what the Russians have been doing is actually politically, if you look at it, they have played a rather marginal role. Most Russian activity has been on the UN Security Council. But if you compare Russian political actions to how active the Americans have been in the region, Secretary of State Blinken and others have been to the region constantly trying to deal with the situation. Russian diplomacy is mostly absent. It's mostly engaging at the level of deputy foreign minister with counterparts in Moscow, but you don't see Russian officials really at a senior level in the region. Russian officials have called for an international conference and have warned against American attempts, again, to quote unquote monopolize diplomacy going forward, because they do not want to see, I think, the Americans running the show, and certainly do not want to see US diplomacy being successful in pacifying the situation. But I also agree with Mark that it's deeply unclear to me how much of a role Russia can actually play, especially now that it appears that it has alienated powerful constituencies in Israel. Just a few quick words about how this all fits into Russia's broader foreign policy. I think Anna has said it already very well. Ukraine remains the utmost priority for Russian foreign policy. And I would say that confrontation with the West over Ukraine, which is ultimately a confrontation over global order, I agree with that, has become the central organizing principle of Russian foreign policy. What does that mean for Russia's policy in the Middle East? The first thing it means is that Russia has really completely abandoned compartmentalization in the Middle East. Not just in the Middle East, I would actually argue globally. We see it in Russia turning its back completely now to nuclear arms control. In the Middle East, even dossiers that were still compartmentalized prior to the invasion of Ukraine, such as humanitarian aid to Syria or the Iranian nuclear dossier, are no longer compartmentalized from this broader confrontation. I think this strategy of everything serving the confrontation over Ukraine also means that the Kremlin wants to create or cultivate pressure points for Western states globally where it can, whether that's in weaponizing grain, whether that's enabling now the DPRK on the Korean Peninsula and Iran in the Middle East, because those actors, emboldened because they feel themselves more supported by Russia, show a greater risk appetite and therefore fuel tensions in those regions. And so you have these metastasizing pressure points for the West, for Western policy that Washington and others need to deal with, while they're already struggling to maintain the support for Ukraine. And so I think that Russia will have an interest in fanning the flames in the region going forward, again, without wanting to provoke a big fire, given the risks to Russian interests. Mm-hmm. I think we'll see this further tilt towards the axis of resistance, and Russia likely trying to be a spoiler to any US-led efforts diplomatically going forward. Perhaps let me end here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Hannah. And now we turn to our final speaker on the panel, Hamid Azizi, who is a visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. He was an assistant professor of regional studies at Shahid Beheshti University and a lecturer in the Department of Regional Studies at the University of Tehran. He's widely published and has a focus on security and geopolitical issues in the Middle East and Central Eurasia, as well as Iranian foreign policy. Hamid?
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, and actually very difficult to speak after my three distinguished colleagues and saying something new. So what I want to do is to focus on a rather more specific topic, how the war in Gaza has impacted Iran-Russia relations, and also to add some Iranian perspective, or what I perceive to be an Iranian kind of reaction to Russia's positioning in the war. So basically, my main argument is that the war in Gaza has basically contributed to a trend that had already started between Iran and Russia since the war in Ukraine, in the sense that since October 7, Russia's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has increasingly aligned with the discourse of Iran and, of course, of its allies in the axis of resistance, as Hannah mentioned. And at the same time, the diplomatic interactions between Tehran and Moscow have been increasingly and overtly focused on the issue of Gaza and the broader regional context in the Middle East. So overall, as I said, the trend that had already started with the war in Ukraine, it's just intensified since October 7. So what I want to do is to actually discuss how the war in Gaza has impacted the relations between Iran and Russia at two levels: at the practical and diplomatic level in terms of the cooperation on the ground and the prospects also for future cooperation, and also at the narrative and conceptual level, because this is something that less discussed in the context of Iran-Russia relations, but it is as important, if not more important, in understanding the whole basically Iranian-Russian relationship. So starting with the actual cooperation, since October 7, there has been at least 7 high-level interactions between Iranian and Russian officials focusing on the issue of Gaza, from the meetings between Iranian foreign minister and Russian foreign minister in New York, to, of course, it happened before that, President Raisi going to Moscow. And in each and every one of these meetings, the issue of Gaza has been raised. And more interestingly, there was on October 26, actually, the Hamas delegation, which was in Moscow at the same time as Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Ali Bagheri was there. I mean, they also had a bilateral meeting, or if I'm not mistaken, it was followed by a trilateral meeting in which a Russian official was also present. So Moscow has become also a venue for of some sort for interactions between Iran and its allies in the axis of resistance. And this is a very important aspect. So what we can, going through the discussions of these meetings, what I could get and I can share with you is that, first of all, as I said, the issue of Gaza has been one of the priorities, especially for the Iranian side. But at the same time, we've seen a convergence in the positions. And what is more important and more recent was actually how this has spilled over into multilateral engagements between Iran and Russia as well. And I'm talking about the latest Astana meeting, between Iran, Russia, and Turkey, which interestingly happened after, despite the fact that Kazakhstan had said, it's not going to hold any, or basically host any further meeting. But in the final statement, there was a clear reference to the situation in Gaza. And it seems to me that, the three countries, Iran, Russia, and Turkey, after establishing this Astana process for Syria, and then after somehow replicating that in the South Caucasus, it's an ongoing effort, but the format we know as 3+3, and which includes, which envisages actually kind of leading role for these three countries. Now they want to also as I said, also expand it to the broader Middle East and to include Gaza. So this multilateral element is also very important. And speaking of the narrative, which comes from, and this is the second level, as I said, which comes from those meetings. There's quite a few points on which you see increasing synergy or harmony between the positions of Iran and Russia. For example, they seem to be unified against what they perceive as Western hypocrisy. It's mentioned by other colleagues before, but basically they both put it in the same context as, they compare it with the reactions that the US had to the war in Ukraine, and they depict it as the West, especially the United States, showing double standards, and as I said, a sign of hypocrisy. And you can see that in the official positions and in the media. And the emphasis on multipolarity and also the kind of changing global order. These are also the things that is something new in Russian-Iranian relations. Again, it started since the war in Ukraine. You wouldn't see such a thing as multipolarity in that sense. We had anti-Americanism, anti-imperialism in the Iranian foreign policy narrative, but not in the sense that, they basically say the same thing as Russia has been saying, the world moving toward a multipolar order and the necessity for also regional interactions to be adapted with that. And as I mentioned, Astana actually, there seems to be also an increasing emphasis on the alternative platforms, because on one hand, they both criticize the ineffectiveness of international organizations like even the United Nations, despite the fact that Russia has been there, but Russia has been complaining about, how Western powers, in this case specifically, the United States have kind of made it impossible to do something substantial for Gaza. And so, I mean, regardless of the level it's going to be successful, and I remain skeptical, there's at least an attempt at the regional level to define alternative platforms, alternative international frameworks for cooperation and for solving problems. And that's why the Astana framework is important. And I think it is as important, I mean, to a different extent, but I mean, in the same context for Turkey and for Iran, obviously it's the same. To summarize this part, actually, it's about like these two actors seeing the world more or less from a similar lens and sharing their kind of broad strategic views. And so finally, in like 2 minutes or so, I just want to mention what we can expect, moving forward. So first of all, it's important to to take into account the fact that the war in Gaza and the serious engagement of Iran's allies and of course Iran itself to some extent has created has basically contributed to the problems between Iran and the West. So the West is the United States, the UK, for example. They are increasingly holding Iran accountable for the activities of the Houthis, Iraqi militias, etc. And at the same time, it has further kind of decreased the chances for any sort of deal, whether it's a revival of the nuclear deal or any new deal between Iran and the West. So this brings Iran closer and closer to its Eastern partners, like Russia and China, because obviously of the lack of option. And then another very important point is that the war in Gaza has actually shown the limits of Iran using its sort of asymmetric warfare capabilities, the proxies, etc., how it can backfire. And some experts are already warning that it may kind of push Iran towards revising its nuclear strategy and going for weaponization. In that case, of course, the relationship with Russia would be very important, how Russia is going to react. I haven't still seen any change in Russia's position with regard to objecting a nuclear weapon for Iran. And finally, and at the same time, basically sticking to the same point, another strategy for Iran, which seems to be on the table already, would be to complement that asymmetric warfare capability, which has been at risk, with going from non-alignment to aligning with great powers, again, with Russia and China. And that's where it relates to longer-term relationship with Russia. I will stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that may be there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I want to encourage the audience as well to use the Q&A if there are questions. There's only one in there right now, which we'll get to momentarily. But I want to thank all the panelists for extremely enlightening comments and discussion. I'll kick off the question and answer here, which is one question that I'm wondering. Well, I mean, one question that seems very common, seems to be a point of non-contention, is that Russia absolutely has jumped in on the side of the axis of resistance, on the side of Iran, however you want to say this, on the pro-Palestinian side of this question. So why was Russia not worried more about its relationship with Israel, given the role of Israel economically, power that Israel holds in the region, but also, again, the point that was brought up briefly, I believe by Mark, the issue about how Israel had kind of really, unlike a lot of the West, kind of like stayed very neutral in terms of Ukraine. Is this part of a, like, I think this is always the question with Putin, where people are wondering, is he playing three-dimensional chess, or is he just reacting to things on the ground? Like, is this part of a, there's been some talk about this move towards Iran since the invasion of Ukraine, and there really had already been a decision to write off Israel, or was this more of a kind of spur of the moment decision? There seemed an opportunity to gain credibility on the Arab street. There seemed a credibility with particular allies, and it might be something that Russia ends up regretting in the longer term. So I'll toss that to anyone who wants to answer it, but I think I would love to hear a little bit more about the consequences of all of this and the thinking behind it. So yeah, Anna.
Yeah. So I'll take a stab at the question. I think first, we don't know exactly. I think it's impossible to know exactly how this decision making took place because the Kremlin is very much a black box. We still we can only judge based on what we see in terms of open source discussions. But I think in terms of, if we look at the practical outcome of Russia siding with the anti-American forces, essentially, in this conflict, is that in practical terms, Israel has not fundamentally changed its position on Russia. In other words, and I think that's where the calculation was, that Israel would be so overwhelmed and tied up, but also from a practical perspective reliant on Russia, that it would not fundamentally take a more aggressive position. And that has to do with two things, chiefly. From the Israeli perspective, Russia's position in Syria, not only Russia's control of the Syrian skies and Russia's goodwill in terms of allowing Israel to conduct its airstrikes against Iran-backed forces in Syria, but also simply Russia's access to the Assad regime, and to a certain extent potentially a potential way of restraining the Assad regime is one. And another is within Russia, within the Russian Jewish community, and what the Russian government could potentially do to the remaining Jewish community within Russia. And again, from a practical perspective, Israel has not changed, has not reversed course. Now, of course, it is important to consider, is this going to change in the long term? Is Israel going to change its position? It's certainly clear that at this stage, Israel would not accept Russia's mediation, as it could have potentially accepted Russia's mediation in case of a war between, let's say, Israel and Hezbollah. Well, I remember discussions about this years ago when Russia was positioning itself as a mediator. And at that stage, the theoretical idea of Russia as a mediator between Israel and Hezbollah was a realistic one. Now, I don't think that's in the cards. But how there's so many unknowns in terms of how this conflict is going to unfold, how the regional implications of this are going to unfold. And I think, again, from the Kremlin's calculation, there are too many unknowns, but the at least short-term and medium-term benefits were more substantial.
Okay, Hannah, did you want to jump in on that?
I agree with Anna. I can't add that much, except perhaps to say two things that I think we already saw somewhat of a cooling in Russia-Israel relations preceding October 7th. Certain statements by Israeli government officials, Naftali Bennett, for example, Yair Lapid, when they were in the government, regarding Ukraine and Russia's war. I mean, I think already, since the invasion of Ukraine, you could tell that there was friction in the Russia-Israel relationship on certain issues, but certainly October 7th and the way that Russia has played this has been a game changer. I agree with Anna that Russia likely calculated, we can't be sure, that because of the situation in Syria and the cards that Russia still holds, Israel just wouldn't have, it couldn't afford to change its position, to break with Russia. If you look at statements coming out of Israel, there are certainly people who express great frustration with Russia, who say Russia shouldn't be forgiven, but those are mostly individuals either in the opposition, like I think Yair Lapid actually gave an interview yesterday only where he said that, or individuals in the Likud party, but certainly not current government officials. They have actually been very cautious in the way that they have commented on Russia and Russian behavior since October 7th. And regarding the possibility of Israeli arms transfers to Kiev and Israel changing its position on lethal weapon support for Ukraine, there might have been a calculation in the Kremlin that after October 7th that wasn't something that was likely going to materialize anytime soon anyway, given the situation that Israel found itself in.
So if there are these calculations about the Israeli response, does that tell us anything about the actual Russian support for Hamas in this particular case? So I mean, is this a second level thing where kind of Russia knows it's going to say Russia's going to say a bunch of things. Israel knows that Russia is going to say a bunch of things, but isn't going to actually do that much. And in the background, Israel and Russia will sort of keep the détente where they are, and so this actually provides like limits to thinking about how much Russia is in reality actually supporting things in the area, or is it just Russia's playing a game where they're trying to get away with both of these things right now, hoping that they can continue to be very vocal in support of one side of the conflict, while the other side is not actually going to cost them anything in Israeli relationships. Maybe Mark, you had said a few things about that earlier.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, Joshua, I like the way you put it. I think that obviously the Russians have unleashed a lot of vitriol, but yet there seems to be some connection still. These are two governments that don't expect to see eye to eye on everything. In other words, that they expect that there's a lot of differences between each other, but that they have been, at least in the past, determined to continue with some kind of cooperation. Certainly, I think Hannah is right that maybe the Russians have calculated that no matter how annoyed the Israelis are, they can't afford to release any weapons to the Ukrainians because they certainly need them themselves. That's possible. But I just think that I don't think either Putin or Netanyahu will willingly sacrifice the relationship. In other words, that they both want to keep it preserved to some extent, that both benefit from its preservation. And so I think that, we will see this happening. And again, in other words, Russia is not arming Hamas directly. And I think Hannah made an interesting point that in Syria we see Russia enabling the axis of resistance more. I guess my question would be: is this a sign of Russian activity, or that Russia sort of surrendering control of what's happening in Syria because it can't do so much itself, so it has to rely on these awful actors, and then make its own balancing game that much more difficult? And maybe they have the hubris to think that they can continue balancing forever. But we've seen during the Cold War that this kind of activity it sometimes blows up. And I think that that's what the Russians risk, especially with regard to an Iranian-Israeli confrontation in particular, because it's like they're not going to side with Israel, certainly, but how much are they going to really side with Iran? And of course, the U.S. would probably get into it. And do they? In other words, it could spin out of control. Sort of the common wisdom in the past has been that Russia doesn't really want peace. It wants to have tension, but it doesn't want it to boil over, because if it boils over, things happen that Russia can't control. And I think that we're at the point now where we're pretty much boiling over, and Russia's preoccupied already. So how much can it do?
Tommy, can I ask you to just follow up on that a little bit? Because what I'm curious about is, if there is this world where Russia is, leaning in on the side of Gaza, leaning in on the side of the axis of resistance, but still trying to have its cake and eat it and can maintain its relationship with Israel, does that at some point cause problems for Russia's relationship with Iran? Would Iran Or is Iran perfectly happy to get what it needs out of Russia, selling it drones, helping in other ways in the Middle East, and doesn't actually worry about the fact that Russia is still trying to maintain these kind of ties with Israel?
Was the question for me or for?
Yeah, for you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I
Yeah. Sorry if you didn't
lost the voice for a second. No,
yeah.
no
From the
worries.
Iranian,
Yeah,
just to summarize, from the
of
Iranian
course.
perspective, is there a limit to Iran's tolerance of Russia continuing to try to play both sides as the conflict escalates? Or is Iran satisfied, with getting what it needs from Russia? And if Russia needs to be, continuing this kind of more quiet relationship with Israel, but not breaking ties with Israel, that's okay. Is that a
Yeah,
potential boiling over pot here, where as tensions escalate in the region, it becomes harder for Iran to tolerate Russia trying to play both sides of this?
Thank you for mentioning this, because that was one of the points I had written down to mention, but then I was running out of time. I couldn't. Actually, yes. I mean, first of all, let me put it in the context of the narrative on the Iranian side. So we basically have had, I mean, this is traditionally so, at least in the Islamic Republic, that we have basically two camps when it comes to relationship with Russia, which to a great point also to a great extent also resembles the factional divide in Iranian politics. So those who are closer, or those who basically see themselves in the hardline and conservative faction, are more pro-Russian, if not in the sense that they see everything Russia does as benefiting Iran, but see more benefits in cooperating and partnership with Russia. And then we have the so-called reformist and moderate camp, which are either quite skeptical of Russia, or at best, emphasize on the necessity to keep a balance. And that was quite evident in the remarks of former Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, for example, in a leaked interview right before the end of his career. He particularly mentioned that, and he criticized clearly Russia's policy toward Iran and the nuclear issue, etc. But the perception on the Iranian side is that since the start of the war in Ukraine, the relationship that was, to a great extent one-sided, has become a two-way street. And Russia's need for logistical support, for drones, etc., makes it kind of more cautious in its dealing with Iran. And this is actually what has happened on the ground, as we can see in Syria. For example, Mark mentioned the kind of whether we can interpret that as Russia abandoning some areas and handing them over to basically Iran benefiting from Russia's war in Ukraine, or some sort of coordination. Either way, it means that Iran has become more and more of an equal partner in that relationship. So this, coupled with the fact that the political scene in Iran has become, if we may say, harmonized, in the sense that the reformist and moderate camp are pushed out of the spectrum, and now the hardline camp has dominated. It means that the desire to go for closer relationship with Russia is there, regardless of the potential downsides of it. So this is the big picture. But very briefly, the problem, I think, is not about, I mean, what they can see as Russia's basically attempt to keep a balance in the relationship has been there for quite some time. And they started siding with Russia knowing that. But the thing is that now they see in some places that the balance is actually tilting toward the Gulf states. And the most evident case was when in the Arab-Russia summit, the latest one in Morocco, Russia basically endorsed a statement that called on Iran and the UAE to negotiate or resolve their differences over disputed islands in the Persian Gulf through international mechanism. And that created a huge backlash. Even, for example, we have Kehan newspaper, which is the most hardline, the most pro-Russian newspaper in Iran. Even that newspaper started criticizing. So that's shifting. I mean, the perception that Russia's economic needs may actually push it more towards cooperation with Gulf states. That's where the next challenge in Iran-Russia relationship may come.
Okay, thank you. And while we have you, Hamid, there's a question from Peter Rutland in the Q&A. To what extent is Iran concerned by Russia's effective abandonment of its Armenian ally?
I mean, it has been a very kind of serious concern for Iran. And the way, I mean, in my interactions with Iranian colleagues and also those who have who are kind of knowledgeable from inside, it's not only about abandoning Armenia, it's actually about acting against Iranian interests in the South Caucasus, in the sense that Russia has basically facilitated or at least endorsed the establishment of the Zangezur corridor, which would, in the way that is presented and of course supported by Turkey and Azerbaijan, and of course also Russia, would cut Iran's access to Armenia. So this is something that at the diplomatic level also Iran is aware of, but the way they are trying to handle this is through the mechanism that I mentioned earlier, through 3+3. So they see a challenge and shifting geopolitical dynamics in the South Caucasus, in the sense that two other major powers in the region, which are Turkey and Russia, are aligned in the sense that it would challenge Iranian interests. And Iran doesn't have the capacity and doesn't have the intention to get involved in that. It already has enough on its plate in other fronts. So what it is trying to do is to, as I said, duplicate that kind of cooperative format that in their eyes worked in Syria, which is Astana format, I mean, of course, in a rather different shape to the South Caucasus, and kind of deal with this challenge through cooperation. But of course, this is something which irritated the Iranians to quite significantly, basically, as far as I can see.
Thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to throw a general question out there about how you think the possible responses by the U.S. to the Houthi attack on U.S. soldiers could affect relations between Russia and Iran, or Iranian, the position of Iran in the Middle East. To anyone on the panel.
May I? Or, yeah.
Absolutely.
I just try to be brief. It's actually where I mentioned that Iran's strategy of asymmetric warfare has backfired, and it actually may, I mean, depending on the actual consequences, it may actually accelerate Iran's kind of push towards a closer relationship with Russia. Because, you know, how it is evolved is that, like, after October 7th, right after the Hamas attack, there was this sense of victory in Iran, in the sense that, you know, the investment has paid off, and you know, Israel is severely damaged, things like that. And then they started to just support their ally, which is Hamas, through a range of coordinated efforts. But now we are at a point that Israel has, on the one hand, Israel has restarted its campaign of targeted assassination, which, by the way, has to do also with Iran-Russia interactions in Syria, in the sense that, you know, we are once again seeing more and more Israeli attacks without, you know, any significant Russian reaction. They oppose, but nothing on the ground. And then, on the other hand, increasing U.S. support for Israel, and the engagement that results in the killing of 3 American soldiers. So, I mean, I would say, regardless of the extent of American response, Iran has already realized the limits of its strategy. And so 2 ways from now. One would be, as I mentioned, going for weaponization of its nuclear program to complement the deterrence that they have been working on. And the other one would be to go for alliance building. And both, interestingly, have to do with Iran's relations with Russia. That's how I see it.
Thank you, Hannah.
Well, I would perhaps just say, I mean, having followed the Russian reactions to the Security Council resolution that was passed on the Houthis in early January, and then the the start of US strikes and subsequent actions by the Houthis, which appear to suggest that they haven't been fully deterred from these US strikes. I think it all sort of plays into Russia's favor to some extent without them sort of having to do very much, just watching from the sidelines. On the one hand, you could argue that the US is now to some extent preoccupied by that evolving situation in the region. They continuously strike. The region is quite in disarray at the moment, even though Kataib Hezbollah just sort of said that they will pause in their strikes. But it is a very volatile situation that demands American bandwidth and resources. And Russia doesn't have to do very much at all. It can just watch that from the sidelines. On the other hand, you could make the argument that US strikes against the Houthis perhaps will be able to mitigate to some extent the threat against maritime trade. And that is also to Russia's benefit, because coming back to the risks and costs for Moscow, this was probably never a situation where Moscow wanted to see the Houthis being too successful in their campaign. So whichever way you turn it, I think it's certainly something that Moscow doesn't mind seeing play out. I did, if you permit me, just want to come back to one, I think, question that Mark raised, which is not a trivial question at all, and I think is quite important more generally if we think about Russian foreign policy in this day and age. He sort of asked, Russia giving greater leeway to the Iranian-backed forces in Syria, was this a matter of necessity, something Russia simply had to do, given its reduced bandwidth, or was this something that Russia did by choice? I think it's a really important question, because in the same vein you could ask, is Russia enhancing its ties with Iran and the DPRK simply because of the practical necessity of needing weapons support from these actors? Or is there something broader at play? If you think this is all just framed through the lens of practical necessity, Russia has to rely on these actors because of the constraints due to the war in Ukraine, now that will inform your answer as to what Russia will give those actors in return. If you look at it through that lens, Russia surely will just give something to these actors that is commensurate with what it has received. So people who tend to make that argument, for example, say, well, Russia will not support the DPRK missile program, let alone its nuclear program, because it will not give away its quote unquote crown jewels just because it gets a few missiles and artillery shells. But the other way of looking at this is that Russia sees these various actors as partners in a broader effort to wear down the West and reduce Western influence in Europe, in the Middle East, in the Indo-Pacific. It's part of a broader global strategy. And if you look at it through that lens, then Russia might well give those actors the kind of support that we might not anticipate or foresee, because Russia will see it in its benefits to see these actors emboldened. I'm not saying that I have sort of very conclusively answered that question for myself, but I would say that I tend to be more in the second camp, looking at those relationships as something more than just as something that meets some of the practical necessities that arose for Russia because of its war against Ukraine. That's just a broader point I wanted to make in this discussion.
If I could just take it to finger, I think I like the way that Hannah has framed this. I would only say that the two arguments are not mutually incompatible, that there could be some degree of necessity that Russia has to do this, but that it sees this as an advantage. And I guess, my question for Hamid Reza is that, at what point does Iran say to the Russians, look, we're helping you a lot with drones, etc. You need to do something more for us to stop Israeli strikes in Syria. All those air defense missiles you have, let's see you use them, or at least claim the Syrians are using them, or whatever. But because this, it seems to me, must be a real irritant for the Iranians that the Russians do nothing to protect them in Syria. And I'm just wondering at what point, in other words, if the relationship is a more equal one, at what point can Iran make demands on this issue?
Yeah, that's may I? Sorry.
Sure. Yep. Go ahead, Ami.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, that's of course a very important matter, and believe me, it's how to say, hotly debated topic in Iran as well, especially among those two lines of factional politics that I mentioned earlier. But the thing is that, the point for Iran, I mean, kind of speaking about on-the-ground necessities and what Iran has been trying to achieve in Syria, it's not been about Russia protecting them. It's been about the main demand on the Iranian side, Russia to allow them to give the green light to Iran to establish its own air defense and radar systems. And that's something that has been already happening. I mean, there has been quite a few reports. I mean, I've seen about, the Iranian radar system being established there. The thing is that on one side, as far as I could follow, Russia had to redeploy some of the air defense facilities from Syria to Ukraine. But at the same time, as I said, there has been this trend of allowing Iran to establish some of the transfer and establish some of its own air defense. But that was actually the reason why after the war in Ukraine, we started to see a kind of intensified Israeli campaign. And also, when you look at the targets, especially more recently during the war, the targets are airports, like the main transit routes that are targeted by the Israelis. So that's how I see it. I mean, I think when it comes to Iranian military decision maker, I mean, at the political level, there have been dissatisfaction. I mean, even publicly, they have discussed about it. But when it comes to military decision makers, I think they are already kind of satisfied with their relationship with Russia in Syria. They expect some things like Su-35, and that's a major demand for Iran. And also sort of military technical cooperation with Russia to go to the next level. These are the things that are not fulfilled yet, and you can still hear even current officials complaining about that from time to time. For example, the defense minister, actually, it was a few months ago, indirectly, somehow tacitly complained about Russia not providing Su-35. But in any case, I mean, it's broader than Syria, I think.
We have a question in the Q&A from Professor Richard Arnold asking, is there any evidence of Russian involvement in helping to provoke the attacks on October 7th? And is there any way that we can think about, in a way that hasn't been discussed previously, how Hamas's actions could be couched in the context of Russian-Iranian relations? It's fine to say no to this, but I think that with all of you gathered here today, this is a question to see if anyone had any thoughts on this. Yeah, Anna.
I think there's no direct evidence. That is how I would phrase it. And the challenge with a question like that is that these issues are usually dealt with through third parties. Russia, for example, for years had armed Hezbollah indirectly through Qasem Soleimani before the U.S. Forces killed him. And so there's no direct evidence, but did the Russians, for example, know about it, but simply didn't provide enough information, didn't share? Was there anything else going on behind the scenes that we simply don't know? When this conflict started, one of the points that I made in the beginning is that for Russia, this was less about Hamas than it was about Iran. And Russia's overall relationship with Iran. Hamas, for its part, has publicly praised Russia for its support. There have been a number of statements. Russia's arms have also found their way into Hamas for years. The Russian side had claimed that these are old weapons, so there's this ongoing discussion about where exactly did these weapons come from. But that all brings us to the fact that if we were to sort of draw a main conclusion from this, is that whether it's the Houthis or Hamas or any other type of paramilitary force, the ability to have access to proxies that could potentially irritate or cause problems for the United States in the Middle East are very important for Russia. And if I may go back to the previous question to the Houthis and U.S. response to the Houthis, what I had said in my opening remarks is that Russia would be using proxies across the globe to help fuel escalation, to help create problems for the United States worldwide. And I think that is the lens through which we should be looking at these relationships from the Russian state perspective. As Mark mentioned earlier, also in his remarks, this is not so much about Hamas for Russia, rather than what it can get out of these relationships in terms of its bigger foreign policy objectives. And as far as U.S. strikes against the Houthis, if the United States is unsuccessful in deterring the Houthis, that will only help fuel Russian narrative. In other words, there's ways Russia can use that to their advantage. And if U.S. strikes are successful, there's an upside as well. And if I may, one last point, I want to go back to what Mark had said earlier about the dangers of escalation for Russia in this context, is I think that's a very important point to revisit. There are dangers, there are challenges, there are risks for Russia. The flip side is that the United States has not found a way to look at Russia holistically across the globe. In other words, it hasn't found a way to connect, for example, Ukrainian theater with the Middle East theater, and how it can simultaneously force Russia to overextend on multiple fronts. So it's not so much about whether or not Russia has a grand strategy or not. It's that the United States has not been able to essentially walk and chew gum at the same time and craft a coherent strategic response. So to me, this is less about Russia's strategy than more about lack of U.S. strategy.
We're running short on time, but so I want to ask like a pointed follow-up to that, but it's also give people the opportunity to answer a more general question. So my pointed follow-up to this is there a sense, I mean, one of the things that I thought a lot about when this conflict started was about how it kind of displaced and pushed to the side all this talk of rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that this has re-centered the Palestinian question in the sort of context of Middle Eastern politics at a point where we were seeing this advancement of Israel's normalization of relationships with predominantly Sunni powers. So my focus question is should we have thought that Russia would be concerned about this KSA Israeli potential pact or not? Is that perfectly fine from Russia's perspective because Russia wants to have relations with both of those places? Or is that something that we would have thought would be concerned? My more broader question is, you know, I started off the Q&A by asking about, was Russia worried about alienating Israel? Should it have been? And then my question, I guess the closest I would close with, more broader related to this, is like, is Russia, or, you know, Russia's actions here seem to be, in the context of this discussion, drawing it closer to the Shia powers and this axis of resistance, which is based around Iran. So what is Russia worried? Should Russia be worried about kind of that its continued actions right now will serve to alienate the Sunni powers, the Gulf states? And Hami, you've talked a little bit about this already from Iran's perspective, they're concerned here. As well as Saudi Arabia. So we have about 5 minutes left. So you can answer any part of that question, but I'm sort of interested in hearing on that. Yeah, Hannah, and then maybe Mark, if you have comments.
I'll just go real quick just on Russia's perception of Israel-Saudi normalization. There were some who argued that Russia could, to some extent, benefit economically if that normalization proceeds because of Israeli investment into Gulf capitals, and Russia is invested there. That might be one way of looking at it, but I would argue that for 3 reasons, Russia always disliked normalization more than it liked it. The first reason is that Russia always lamented that the Abraham Accords and all diplomacy flowing from it in the region was an American project that sidelined Russia. Again, Russia lamenting the quote-unquote US monopolization of the peace process in the region, Russia calling for a revival of the quartet, wanting to have a seat at the table. Normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia sidelines the Russians. They don't like it. That was the first reason. The second reason was that deal would have entailed some form of agreement on a civilian nuclear energy program for Saudi Arabia. I mean, question over the Saudis having enrichment capability, the devil was in the detail in terms of what would be allowed. But that was one of the components of the deal. And I do think that Rosatom still harbors hopes for getting its foot in a Saudi nuclear program itself. So that was the second reason. And then the third reason was that Israel-Saudi normalization would have entailed greater defense cooperation between those countries, and hence a more formidable alliance vis-a-vis the Iranians in the region, which I do think the Russians see as a partner. So further defense integration between Israel and the Gulf states as a, in opposition to Iran is also something that I think the Russians would have looked at with concern at a minimum. So for this whole effort to be at a minimum postponed, if not derailed, is beneficial to Russia for those three reasons at a minimum.
Interesting. Mark, maybe we'll give you the last word.
Right. Well, I certainly agree with Hannah. I mean, the Russians just never liked the Abraham Accords. I mean, mainly because they weren't involved in them. That they just liked the piecemeal American approach to conflict resolution. Yeah, and they weren't involved. And now, of course, with I think that they're not unhappy that the Saudi-Israeli Abraham Accord didn't go forward. But look, what I think is interesting is none of the other Abraham Accords have been broken, in other words, and we even see a degree of UAE cooperation with Israel. European countries stopped flying to Israel, not the UAE. Their aircraft are still kept flying there, and I think also that Saudi Arabia and Israel don't have to have diplomatic relations to cooperate, and it seems that these folks are talking to each other. The Saudis, the Emiratis, they don't want to see Hamas succeed, that's for sure. And I think that's why I think really the Russians are kind of more aligning themselves with these Sunni governments on this conflict more than anything else. But I think, again, the real risk for, I think both Anna and Hannah have put it right, that the Russians see themselves in a global conflict. And Putin has even said so. And that it's taken the Americans and the Europeans just don't seem to see it that way, that these are, sort of contained conflicts and somehow they're not connected, but they all are. And I think that it's going to take a real effort to get Western public opinion, Western governments to understand that.
Anna, I saw your hand was up. Did you want to add something? You're still muted.
I was nodding in agreement with Mark, and I know we have a minute left, but I think the point that he ended on is a really important one, and that is the backing of Western public opinion on these issues. The ability to articulate to Western audiences why these conflicts matter to them directly, why do they affect them directly, and what will happen if Russia wins, what will happen if Ukraine wins.
Thank you. Let me then, on behalf of the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia and the New York City Russia Public Policy Series, thank all of you very much for your participation today. I have found this to be absolutely enormously enlightening, and it has been a really valuable conversation, and I appreciate you taking your time to spend some time with us today. I want to thank our audience for joining us both here and on YouTube. We really appreciate you taking some time out of your day today to join us, but also the panelists as well. Elise, do you want to say final words?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone. I agree. This is a fascinating discussion, and I want to invite our audience and panelists to join us for a future Russia Public Policy series. We have a few more coming up this semester.
Including the next one on February 21st. So we're going to have, that'll be our next one is currently scheduled, and it is tentatively scheduled to be looking about what is happening in the occupied Ukrainian territories at this point in time. So that's the next one tentatively on the schedule, but keep an eye out for communications from both Harriman and the Jordan Center. Elise?
Thank you, and thanks for our audience.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.